All right, today we got Heart Shaped Box by Joe Hill. My copy's kind of falling apart, apparently. I know it's probably tiresome to review a Joe Hill book through comparison with his dad's work, Stephen King, if you didn't already know. I really didn't want to have to do it this way, but their voices as writers are so similar to me that it's almost impossible not to. Their prose, their turns of phrase, the way they write analogies and metaphors, their dialogue, their cultural sensibilities. Just everything about their ethos as writers is so uncannily similar that it literally forces you to reckon with the idea that inherited characteristics shape a lot more of our lives than we'd perhaps think. Or I'm just being dramatic and Joe Hill read a lot of his dad's books when he was growing up and some of the stuff rubbed off on him. Regardless, I think making the comparison, trite as it may be, is justified considering I probably would never have read this book in the first place if he wasn't Stephen King's son. Now, as far as the actual content of Heart Shaped Box is concerned, I have a lot of mixed feelings. There are things I liked about it, there are things I disliked about it, and it's kind of hard to talk about without going into its somewhat strange plot. On the surface, it's a pretty simple concept. You have this aging rock star named Judas Coyne, and he's into the occult, into macabre things. He likes collecting sort of creepy artifacts, and so he buys a haunted suit on the internet. Turns out, however, that not only is the suit genuinely haunted by a ghost, but that it's haunted by a specific ghost named Craddock McDermott, who is the grandfather of Judas's now dead ex-girlfriend, Florida, aka Anna, who committed suicide. And this ghost is essentially determined to haunt and torture Judas as a form of revenge for the poor way that he treated Florida. The first act of this book is very interesting because Judas Coyne is by all accounts a giant asshole. He's rude, he's selfish, he's emotionally distant towards the very few people in his life who care about him, like his assistant Danny and his current girlfriend Georgia, aka Mary Beth. Yes, he just calls the women he's currently with by the state he was in when they met, and he's just written as an all-around kind of unsympathetic character. In fact, when Craddock first begins to haunt Judas, it almost seems sort of justified in a way. Judas was by all accounts a pretty terrible boyfriend who directly caused this guy's granddaughter to kill herself, so maybe he deserves this haunting in some sort of cosmic justice type of way. I actually think Judas is a pretty interesting and compelling protagonist for this reason. He's complicated and dark and unique, not just the most boring man of all time who also happens to be a writer like some Stephen King protagonists, no offense. I like that he's abrasive, I like his famous rock star persona. Clearly this type of music is important to Joe Hill in real life given the enormous amount of references to 80s and 90s music all throughout this thing. It's actually kind of funny to see Joe Hill utilize cultural references in pretty much the exact same way as Stephen King, but the references themselves are just pushed back about 2 decades. Now, unfortunately, I do think this book goes pretty heavily off the rails once you start getting into the middle of it. Jude and Mary Beth basically hop in a car and start driving south to escape the ghost, and the story starts to feel kind of directionless and a bit hard to follow at this point. It turns out Jude's dogs have some mystical abilities, and they're able to fend off the ghosts long enough for them to be able to get out of town. So they go to Georgia's grandma's house to talk to Florida's spirit with the Ouija board to try to convince her from the afterlife to tell Craddock to lay off, basically. Then they go to Florida, the state, to try to get Florida's sister to do something about the ghost, since she's the one who sent the suit over in the first place. Then, completely out of left field, you find out that Craddock is actually a child molester, and it was actually him who killed Anna once she threatened to out him. I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain. The way the plot unfolds, it just feels very erratic and aimless, and even though I can occasionally see what direction Joe Hill is trying to go in, it very often just didn't work for me. For example, it seems like he kind of wants to flip the rules of Jude and Craddock, making Jude seem more sympathetic throughout the book and making Craddock seem less sympathetic, but the revelation that Craddock is actually a pedophile kind of negates the whole guilt and redemption arc Jude was going through. The idea that Jude was such an awful guy that he drove his girlfriend to suicide is really dark and gritty and upsetting, and it just kind of turns out that the whole thing wasn't even true. He has no real reason for guilt, nothing really to redeem, because the whole thing just wasn't his fault in the first place. Yeah, he was a shitty boyfriend, but Anna would have died regardless. The ending was also puzzling, with Jude somehow making a portal to the afterlife with Mary Beth's blood that allowed Anna Anna to come through and destroy the ghost of Craddock. It didn't really land. It was confusing. It felt very unplanned, like Joe Hill kind of just felt the need to put something on the page just to end the book in some way. Also, there's this weird ghost love triangle thing at the end with Anna and Mary Beth merging into one composite character, even though their only real similarity is that they're both Jude's girlfriends and they're both goth. Just felt like he wrote those two characters in such an unintentionally similar way that he was kind of forced to combine their role at the end. I think there could potentially be something interesting buried in the concept of this book, but I'm not really sure that heart-shaped box pulls it off. Also, I just wanted to mention this somewhere. There's this weird recurring bit all throughout the book about how much Anna asks questions, like, as a personality trait. Like, her entire personality was, she just asks a lot of questions. And it was talked about over and over again as that's a normal personality trait to have. Like, you can just describe a person as they ask a lot of questions. I don't know, I just thought it was weird, and every time it came up, it just kind of felt strange and unnatural. With all that being said, despite the book going pretty heavily off the rails once it gets to the middle, I thought the first act was very great. It was full of a ton of genuinely scary scenes. Craddock just ominously showing up and slinking around Jude's house was pretty terrifying. The way he just appears and doesn't move and can only be seen in the dark. The scariest scene in the whole book to me is probably about a third of the way in, when Jude walks in on Georgia in his office, just completely hypnotized, transfixed, watching this snuff film that Jude keeps around the mansion as a souvenir. Don't really know how to explain it, but it's written with this really slowly building, kind of palpable sense of dread that I thought was really well done. Also, the way that Craddock is kind of able to get inside people's heads and take over their willpower and try to get them to hurt themselves is a pretty interesting and novel concept as well. It does a good job of adding a feeling of real danger to this ghost character who's also just creepy. Again, though, once you get further into the book, a lot of the horror elements start to dissipate and it kind of just turns into this ghost thriller, which I thought was much less engaging. I think it's worth it to note, though, that this is Joe Hill's first published novel, and he's had a lot of sustained success since releasing it, so I'm more than willing to give some of his later books another chance. I think this book showed a lot of promise. It does have some impressively scary moments, some interesting and dynamic characters. It's generally well written from a technical standpoint, but too much of this book just felt kind of haphazardly strewn together for this book to coalesce into anything that I would consider great or even that good. I think I'm going to give Heart-Shaped Box 5 heart-shaped boxes out of 10.